They say red wine stains never come out completely. As I watched that expensive Bordeaux seep into Mrs. Wellington's designer purse at the charity gala, I realized I was about to learn just how permanent some stains really are. I am Eleanor Vance, and at 78 years old, I thought I had seen everything life could throw at me. I had buried a husband, raised a son, and spent decades perfecting the art of quilting. My hands, weathered by years of careful stitching, had created beauty from scraps that others might have discarded. But nothing had prepared me for the moment when my own family would treat me like one of those discarded pieces. The charity gala was Jessica's idea, of course. My daughter-in-law had insisted I attend, though her reasons became clear only later. She wanted me there as a prop, a sweet elderly mother-in-law who would smile quietly in the background while she networked with the city's elite. I had dressed carefully that evening, choosing my best navy dress, the one I had worn to my husband's funeral 5 years earlier. It still fit well, though Jessica had made several pointed comments about its age. The accident happened near the silent auction tables. I had been examining a beautiful watercolor painting, thinking how the artist's use of light reminded me of the morning sun streaming through my old kitchen window, when someone bumped into me from behind. The wine glass in my hand tilted, and its contents splashed across Mrs. Wellington's ostrich leather handbag. The woman gasped, her face contorting with horror, as if I had deliberately vandalized a priceless artifact. Before I could even begin to apologize, Jessica appeared at my side like a storm cloud. Her fingers dug into my arm with surprising strength as she pulled me away from the crowd that had gathered to witness my humiliation. Through gritted teeth, she hissed words that cut deeper than any physical blow. She told me I couldn't do anything right, that this was the most important event of her year, and that I had ruined everything. But it was what came next that truly broke something inside me. Jessica turned to Mrs. Wellington with a practiced smile, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she apologized for her mother-in-law's clumsiness. She explained that I was getting quite forgetful in my old age, that sometimes these things happened with elderly people. She made me sound like a doddering old woman who couldn't be trusted with a simple glass of wine. The crowd nodded with understanding, their eyes now looking at me with pity rather than respect. David, my son, materialized beside us with his usual weak smile. Instead of defending me, he simply took my other arm and guided me to a quiet corner, his face flushed with embarrassment. He mumbled something about how accidents happen, but his tone suggested he agreed with his wife's assessment of my declining capabilities. The drive home to their penthouse was silent, except for Jessica's occasional sighs of exasperation. I sat in the back seat like a chastened child, watching the city lights blur past the window, and wondering when I had become such a burden. When we arrived at their pristine apartment, with its cold marble surfaces and designer furniture that seemed to reject any sign of human warmth, the real confrontation began. Jessica exploded the moment the door closed behind us. She had been holding back her fury all evening, and now it poured out like water through a broken dam. She told me she had warned me to stay home, that I always managed to embarrass her in front of important people. She said the musty smell of age that clung to me made people around us hold their breath in discomfort. She claimed I was a relic from another era, completely out of place in her carefully curated world. For the first time in months, I found my voice. I told her that what she smelled was the scent of a life lived fully, of years spent working with my hands, not the artificial perfume of someone trying to mask their insecurities. The words surprised even me with their sharpness. Jessica's response was swift and violent. She didn't just raise her voice. She shoved me hard with both hands. I stumbled backward, my hip catching the sharp corner of their glass coffee table before I fell to the floor. The pain was immediate and intense, radiating through my body like fire. David rushed forward, but instead of helping me up, he went to Jessica first, checking to see if she was all right after her outburst. As I lay there on their expensive Persian rug, tasting blood from where I had bitten my tongue, Jessica delivered her ultimatum. She screamed that she couldn't take it anymore, that David would have to choose between his mother and his wife. She threatened to have her lawyers draw up papers the following week to have me committed to a state nursing home and declared incompetent so they could take control of my finances. She said it was over. Finished. Done. David stood frozen, his face pale as paper. He said nothing in my defense. Nothing to challenge his wife's threats. In that moment, I realized that my son, the boy I had rocked through countless childhood fevers and celebrated through every small triumph, had already made his choice. The next morning, after a sleepless night on their guest room bed, I made a phone call that would change everything. Margaret had been my neighbor for 15 years before I sold my house to help David and Jessica with their financial troubles. She was a retired lawyer with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, and she had never liked Jessica's treatment of me. Margaret arrived within an hour of my call, taking one look at the bruises already forming on my hip and arm, before pulling out her phone to take pictures. She listened to my story without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail. When I finished, she didn't offer empty comfort or suggest that family relationships were complicated. Instead, she told me bluntly that what Jessica had done constituted elder abuse, and that her threats about the nursing home and financial guardianship were serious legal matters that needed immediate attention. Over the next few days, while David and Jessica were away on a weekend business trip, Margaret and I began to uncover the full extent of their betrayal. We searched through the papers in David's home office, looking for any documents related to my finances. What we found was worse than I had imagined. After I had sold my beloved house and given them the proceeds to help with their investments, David had used the money to fund one of Jessica's family's failed business ventures. Even more shocking, we discovered that they had forged my signature on several financial documents, giving Jessica power of attorney over my remaining assets. They hadn't just taken advantage of my generosity, they had committed outright fraud. But the discovery that hurt most was tucked away in Jessica's closet. She had been secretly communicating with Sterling Gallery downtown about selling my life's work, a massive quilt I had spent 3 years creating, called The Quilt of Truth. This piece told the story of my entire life through fabric and thread, each square representing a memory, a loss, a triumph. Jessica saw it as valuable artwork that could open doors to the high society she desperately craved. To me, it was my soul made manifest in cotton and silk. Margaret wasted no time in contacting her former colleagues in the legal profession. Within days, we had documented everything: the physical abuse, the financial fraud, the forged signatures, and the unauthorized plans to sell my artwork. But Margaret had something more dramatic in mind than a simple lawsuit. The plan we hatched was audacious and risky. Margaret had maintained her connections in the art world through her retirement, and she reached out to the very gallery Jessica had been courting. She arranged for my quilt to be displayed in an upcoming show, but not in the way Jessica had envisioned. The night of the gallery opening, David and Jessica arrived in their finest clothes, expecting to be celebrated as the family of an emerging textile artist. They had spent the week trying to act normally after returning home to find legal papers waiting for them, but I could see the strain in their faces. David looked haggard and worried, while Jessica maintained her usual mask of superiority, though it seemed more brittle than usual. When they entered the gallery, they found the quilt of truth hanging in the place of honor, just as Jessica had hoped. But beside it, instead of the typical artist's statement and price tag, stood a large video screen. As they watched in growing horror, the screen began playing a documentary that Margaret and I had created with the help of a journalist friend of hers. The video told my story in my own words, interwoven with photographs of my bruises, copies of the forged documents, and even a recording that my grandson Leo had secretly made of one of Jessica's violent outbursts. My voice narrated the tale of abuse, fraud, and manipulation, while images of my beautiful quilt served as a counterpoint to the ugly reality of how I had been treated. The gallery was packed with the same social elite who had witnessed my humiliation at the charity gala. This time, however, they weren't looking at me with pity. They were staring at David and Jessica with a mixture of shock and disgust. Flashbulbs began popping as journalists moved in for statements and quotes. Jessica tried to push through the crowd toward the exit, her face twisted with rage and panic. She screamed that it was all lies, that I was a bitter old woman trying to destroy her family. But her protests only made her look more guilty in the eyes of the witnesses. David stood paralyzed in the center of the chaos, finally understanding the magnitude of what they had done and what they were about to lose. The legal consequences came swiftly. The district attorney's office launched a criminal investigation into the financial fraud, while Child Protective Services became involved due to concerns about Leo's welfare in a home where domestic violence had occurred. Jessica's social standing evaporated overnight as news of the scandal spread through their circle of friends and business associates. Jessica faced charges for elder abuse, fraud, and forgery. Her family's assets were frozen pending investigation, and she was forced to move out of the penthouse and back in with her parents, tail between her legs. David, caught between his wife and his mother, chose to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. He filed for divorce and entered court-mandated therapy as part of his plea agreement. Meanwhile, my life began to transform in ways I hadn't expected. The publicity from the gallery showing brought attention to my quilting work from legitimate collectors and museums. Several pieces sold for substantial amounts, giving me financial independence I hadn't enjoyed in years. More importantly, the foundation I established with part of the proceeds, called the Vance Foundation, a quilt of dignity, began helping other elderly victims of family abuse. I used my newfound resources to purchase a small house with a garden in a quiet suburban neighborhood. For the first time in years, I had my own space, my own rules, and my own schedule. I set up a proper quilting studio in the spare bedroom, with good lighting and plenty of room to spread out my projects. The silence of my own home felt like luxury after months of walking on eggshells in David and Jessica's apartment. The hardest part was learning to trust my own judgment again. For so long, I had second-guessed every decision, wondering if I was indeed becoming forgetful or incompetent, as Jessica had claimed. Therapy helped me understand that her criticism had been a form of control, designed to make me dependent and compliant. Recognizing this pattern was painful, but liberating. Leo came to visit me every other weekend, per the custody arrangement David had negotiated. At first, the visits were awkward and sad. My grandson carried the weight of his parents' divorce and the upheaval in his young life. But gradually, as we worked together on simple quilting projects, he began to open up about his feelings and fears. Through our conversations, I learned that Leo had been aware of the tension in his home long before the final confrontation. He had seen his father's weakness and his mother's cruelty, and he had felt powerless to protect me. His decision to record Jessica's abuse had been his own small act of rebellion against the injustice he witnessed daily. David's road to redemption was longer and more complicated. The therapy sessions forced him to confront his role in enabling Jessica's behavior and his failure to protect his own mother. He lost his job due to the scandal and had to start over in a different field. His visits to my home were initially tense and filled with awkward apologies. But time has a way of healing even the deepest wounds when there is genuine remorse and effort involved. David began working as a social worker, dedicating himself to helping other families navigate crisis and conflict. He attended Al-Anon meetings to address his codependent patterns and slowly rebuilt his relationship with both Leo and me. 1 year after that terrible night when everything fell apart, I was in my studio working on a new piece when I heard a car pull into my driveway. Through the window, I could see David helping Leo out of the back seat, the boy carrying a small bundle of fabric scraps we had been collecting for his first independent project. David didn't rush to the door as he once might have. Instead, he stood at the edge of my garden, his posture respectful and patient. When I opened the door, he asked if he could bring Leo in for his quilting lesson. There was something different in his voice, a humility and genuine respect that hadn't been there during his marriage to Jessica. As Leo ran ahead into the studio, chattering about the pattern he wanted to try, David lingered in the doorway. He looked older, more worn by the experiences of the past year, but there was also a clarity in his eyes that I recognized from his childhood. He was finding his way back to the man I had hoped he would become. Leo spread his fabric pieces across my cutting table with the careful concentration of a child learning something precious. I showed him how to arrange the colors and patterns, explaining that the first piece of any quilt is the most important because it sets the foundation for everything that follows. As we worked together, David watched from the corner, and I could see him understanding that we were building something new from the fragments of what had been broken. The quilt Leo and I created that day was small and simple. Nothing like the elaborate works that had made me famous, but it represented something far more valuable than artistic achievement. It was proof that relationships could be rebuilt with patience, honesty, and mutual respect. Each stitch was a commitment to doing better, to choosing love over convenience, and truth over comfortable lies. As the months passed, our Sunday quilting sessions became a ritual that all three of us treasured. David would arrive early to help set up the workspace and stay late to help clean up, using those quiet moments to share his own struggles and growth. He told me about the families he was working with, the children he was trying to protect, and the ways his own experiences had given him insight into cycles of abuse and neglect. Leo grew more skilled with each visit, his small fingers becoming deft with needle and thread. But more than that, he grew more confident in his own voice and opinions. He learned that his thoughts and feelings mattered, that adults could be wrong, and that standing up for what is right sometimes requires courage, but is always worth the effort. The foundation I had established continued to grow, helping dozens of elderly people escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives. Each success story reminded me that my own ordeal had served a larger purpose. The pain I had endured became a source of strength for others who faced similar struggles. Margaret, who had been instrumental in my transformation, became more than a legal advisor. She was a true friend who understood the complicated emotions involved in setting boundaries with family members. She had her own stories of difficult relationships and the courage required to prioritize self-respect over keeping the peace. On quiet evenings in my garden, surrounded by the flowers I had planted and tended myself, I often reflected on the journey that had brought me to this place of peace. The physical bruises Jessica had inflicted had healed within weeks, but the emotional scars had taken much longer to fade. Learning to trust my own perceptions again, to believe that I deserved respect and kindness, had been the hardest part of my recovery. The quilt of truth still hangs in my studio, no longer for sale at any price. It serves as a reminder of where I came from and how far I have traveled. Sometimes visitors ask about its meaning, and I tell them it represents the power of telling one's story honestly, even when that truth is painful or inconvenient for others. I sleep well in my own bed these days, no longer listening for footsteps in the hallway or bracing myself for criticism, disguised as concern. My days are filled with purposeful work, meaningful relationships, and the simple pleasure of making my own choices. The woman who cowered on that Persian rug, bleeding and broken, feels like someone I once knew, rather than someone I used to be. David still struggles sometimes with guilt. Over the years, he remained silent, while Jessica treated me badly. During one of our conversations, I told him that forgiveness is not about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It's about choosing to move forward without letting past wounds poison future possibilities. We cannot change what was, but we can decide what will be. Leo, now 8 years old, has completed 3 small quilts of his own. Each one tells a story from his young life. His parents' divorce, starting at a new school, making new friends. He has learned that difficult experiences can be transformed into something beautiful when we approach them with honesty and creativity. His resilience gives me hope for the future and reminds me that healing is always possible. The seasons change in my garden now, and I change with them. Spring brings new plantings and fresh possibilities. Summer offers long, productive days in my studio. Fall provides time for reflection and harvesting the fruits of my labor. Winter gives me quiet months to plan and dream about what comes next. I am no longer the woman who accepted cruelty as the price of family harmony, who believed that keeping the peace was more important than maintaining my dignity. I have learned that love without respect is not love at all, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's worst impulses. The gallery continues to display my work, and collectors from around the world have purchased pieces that will outlive me by many generations. But my greatest creation is not made of fabric and thread. It is the life I have built for myself from the scraps of what others threw away, a masterpiece of resilience and self-determination that no one can ever take from me. Every morning when I wake up in my sun-filled bedroom, surrounded by the quilts I have made and the peace I have earned, I am reminded that it is never too late to start over. Age is not a limitation, but an advantage, bringing wisdom and perspective that only come from having survived life's trials and tribulations. The red wine stain may never have come out of Mrs. Wellington's purse, but the stain of shame and helplessness has been completely washed away from my soul. In its place is something far more precious: the knowledge that I am worthy of respect, capable of strength, and deserving of love that lifts me up rather than tears me down. This is my story, my truth, my quilt of dignity. And like all the best quilts, it will keep me warm for whatever winters may still lie ahead.